Hi, this is Scott Bradfield. Welcome to the bathtub. Last week we talked about a writer you probably don't know about, who I referred to as the Flann O'Brien of Oklahoma. And after finishing that, I felt, well, we had to talk about the Flann O'Brien of Ireland, and that is, of course, Flann O'Brien, one of the great comic, brilliant geniuses of literary prose. Great, incredible prose writer. Just writes beautiful sentences. A better prose writer in many ways than Lafferty. Often, though Lafferty hits that pitch. It's just he writes a lot more, and he didn't really write as much. He tended to write. He wrote a lot of columns. I guess I've never read the columns. He wrote a lot of columns for the Irish Times, I believe. Flann O'Brien. He wrote it under a name that I can't pronounce, and that's available. You get a lot of those old columns are still available. Dalkey Archives have been reprinting a lot of the Flann O'Brien. But today we're going to talk about, we're going to work our way from the top down in the bathtub over the next few years and start with, I think, this greatest novel, The Third Policeman. If you have not read The Third Policeman, you have to get Third Policeman and get it into the bathtub as soon as you possibly can. You have to concentrate because it is a very dense and comic, funny novel. You have to really pay attention. The ideas are as fast and furious as Lafferty. I think that's the thing I see about both of them. They both come up with crazy ideas you've never heard of before and you haven't heard of since. And I'll try to give you just a few examples of it in Flann O'Brien, and I'll do it imperfectly. This is the edition I prefer. It's the British Picador edition because it's got the Stedman pictures, which, the kind of gross, horrific, nightmarish comedy of Flann O'Brien kind of is perfect for Stedman. And I love these old paperbacks from the UK. So The Third Policeman has a number of interesting things about it. First of all, I think I forgot this since the last time I read it, which was 30 years ago. But it was written in 1940 by Flann O'Brien. His first novel, which we will read eventually, is called At Swim Two Birds. And that had a fairly good reputation. James Joyce deigned to tell everyone it was a good book. And after that, Flann O'Brien wrote The Third Policeman, which no one would publish. It's one of the great crimes of literary history. This book was not published when it came out. And it was not published till 27 years later after Flann O'Brien died, which I find this amazing. It's a hilarious novel. Now, for those of you who don't like, who need spoiler alerts, let me shout, spoiler alert, spoiler alert. I don't think it matters to know this. But about 20 pages into the book, the narrator of the novel dies. He's going into an old house of an old man who he's murdered, and he's looking for a black box. It's supposed to contain some sort of things, and he passes out, and then the nightmarish comedy of the book begins. It is basically, kind of Alice in Wonderland on acid with a huge block of Hieronymus Bosch and darkness mixed in with it. So there's a lot of ludicrousness and idiocy and craziness in the book, but it all has a great coherent narrative logic to it. So once you get into the dream world of The Third Policeman, you follow a trail that takes you back ultimately to the man through 16 years later, as the narrative consciousness of the novel slowly realizes he's become a ghost, and he goes back and haunts the man who killed him, and I won't tell you any more than that. So in the course of the book, he's experiencing and discussing all sorts of peculiar ideas, philosophical ideas, with the various characters. Most prominently are three policemen who have a police house somewhere in this landscape, this nightmarish landscape, which is rendered in beautiful prose. And as the narrator moves from this kind of haunted house out into this landscape of the three policemen, he discusses a whole bunch of ideas. And that's the comedy of the book, is all the crazy ideas that they're discussing. In the background is a character named De Selby, who is some sort of theosophist character who has lots of crazy ideas. I forget what they are, but they all tend to be related to the idea that life and experience is an illusion. And nothing's really happening around us. And we can control the illusion if in various ways, and it's the same as reality. So one of this crackpot guy's, de Selby's theories, is that when we travel through the world, we're just imagining the travel, and that we can really simulate travel. If we, for example, if we were going to travel to Brighton on the train, we could get a series of postcards. We could sit in the basement with a series of postcards, and we could do something to rattle a chair. And if we created the experience of going to Brighton and back, we would literally go to Brighton and back. So that's one of the many jokes in the book. There's so many funny ideas in it. I try to write a few down, and I'll forget most of them. There's one point where there's the idea that the policemen come as you get older, and your color changes as you grow older. The most important part of it is that the policemen, whenever you go see the police, the first thing they ask you is this about a bicycle? Because all the policemen have bicycles, and everyone, I guess, in Dublin is riding around on bicycles. And the central premise is that in a world filled with atoms that are constantly moving, if you're on a bicycle, you and the bicycle exchange identities. So some of the bicycle's parts come into you, and some of you go into the bicycle. And so these policemen have these different theories. One of the policemen keeps his bicycle locked up in the brig because he doesn't want to go off doing things that it shouldn't do. And I think there's at one point they're talking about hanging a bicycle for murder because of the character who drove the bicycle. And the idea is a man riding the bicycle, or is the bicycle riding the man? Some of these jokes come through it. There's so many funny jokes in it. I don't want to ruin any more of them. Oh, there's one where there's lots of flashbacks. Some of the stuff, much of the book is rendered in footnotes about the crazy de Selby. Some entire chapters are nothing but footnotes to the story, as the narrator, who doesn't really have a name, is recalling his knowledge of this. This kid, he's a theosophist. He's like a Madame Blavatsky type who's surrounded by people who either say he's a genius or say he's a crackpot. And one of his theories is that he wants to dilute water. So I get this, these ideas are coming like one page after another. But de Selby decides he wants to learn how to dilute water. And so what happens at one point is in the narrative, in going back and not the narrative, in the historical documents that the narrator is referring to, this de Selby was somewhere in Dublin pumping, tens of thousands of gallons of water into his house, and the water wasn't coming out. It was just going into the house. And somehow he was diluting the water. And of course, most of it's just the crackpots who believe anything these theosophists told them. I guess I'll read. There's a wonderful little part. There's so many parts I can't really read anything out of context, except you need to know that basically it's a sort of Alice in Wonderland story. After about page 20, there's a lot of withheld information by the narrator about the man he lives with, and the way they murder this man, and the relationship with this other character named Divney, John Divney, I think is his name. And much of that's withheld, but it all makes perfect sense, and it all comes through to you eventually if you just pay attention. It reminds me a little bit, there's a lot of good writers who do that. They withhold a lot of the information. They don't explain everything, and you do pick it up by the end of the book when you find out that Divney has married this woman that the narrator had wanted to go out with. There'd been some conflict about the woman, but it's not all stuck in your face. So I'm just going to read it. So eventually, at one point, the narrator has been, in the dream landscape, has been convicted of murder, and they're going to hang him. And a large part of the book is about the narrator watching people build a gallows where he's supposed to be hung, and he escapes on one of the policemen's bicycles, which seems to have has developed a feminine identity. And I just read a real brief paragraph as he runs off on the bike, which becomes the best relationship with a woman he's ever had. Page 150 of this edition. How can I convey the perfection of my comfort on the bicycle, the completeness of my union with her, the sweet responses she gave me at every particle of her frame? I felt that I had known her for many years, that she had known me, and that we understood each other utterly. She moved beneath me with agile sympathy and a swift, airy stride, finding smooth ways among the stony tracks, swaying and bending skillfully to match my changing attitudes, even accommodating her left pedal patiently to the awkward working of my wooden leg. He has a wooden leg, and lots of people with wooden legs start showing up. So that's just a brief. There's not a word misplaced in this book. All the time I was reading this book, the one thing that kept coming to my mind was I remember when we started the bathtub lectures, I did something like 24 lectures on Ulysses, as you know, this what's not with some recognition that it probably is too much space for that book. This book by itself is worth 10 times the weight in gold of Ulysses. It's a much more beautifully written book. It's a complete entertainment. It's a complete nightmare. It's a perfect little story. And I would really recommend, if you haven't read Flann O'Brien, get this one. Read The Third Policeman. And we'll do some more Flann O'Brien, because there's much of him I haven't read. And his most famous book is At Swim Two Birds, which we're probably trying to do eventually as well. So there he is, the Flann O'Brien of Ireland. Flann O'Brien. Don't miss The Third Policeman. Okay. See you soon. I don't know what we're doing next week. I forget. Oh, I know what we're going to do. We're going to do Eve Babbitt's. Okay. Bye.